Hey folks, welcome to Friendly Orbit, the podcast that draws us together no matter how far we fly. I'm Ceres, your kindness conduit and mental health cultist, joined by...
The worst podcaster ever, and why you're even listening to my voice, it's so annoying. It's Thea.
This week we're going to take a break from our normal topics and talk about a topic related to mental health, which I know is a radical left turn for this podcast, but I read an interesting book by Kristin Neff called Self-Compassion, and I thought it was interesting enough that I wanted to summarize it and go over it and discuss it on the podcast. So here we are.
All right. And today I have prepared some scathing criticism to his arguments that I still have to hear in order to provide a dialectic environment of discussion.
Ignition sequence start. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff.
So Kristin Neff's book, Self-Compassion, is all about basically how we use internal self-criticism and how we can use internal self-compassion as varying models for how to live your life, especially varying models for motivation, as in what motivates you to change, to achieve things that you want to achieve. From the start, I'm going to represent the perspective that is portrayed in the book as I understood it as a reader. And we're not going to be able to get into everything that's in the book. And from the start, I would want to acknowledge that it is a model, right? She's a researcher on self-compassion. She's very convinced of its powers. I am convinced that she is right in some regards, right? But it's a model that from which you can borrow elements to help you deal with your own issues and deal with your mental health. It's not like I think the incorrect way to view this content would be as like a Bible. Like everything she says is 100% correct, and it's the only way to do it, right?
I don't think anyone who listens to our podcast thinks that we're 100% right.
If you listen to our podcast, if you listen to any of our episodes and think to yourself, this is 100% correct, you're in the wrong place.
Because sometimes Sari says things, and those are the wrong bits.
Right, so it's only 50% correct, because Thea is always right. But
yeah, thank you.
And Ceres is never right, so it's 50-50.
No, you have a good 80%, I think. 80% correct, right?
Oh, okay. All right, well, to start off the discussion, I'm going to start actually not with self-compassion, but with what I would say is often the default model in many societies for how we interact with ourselves and how we motivate ourselves. And that is that we use self-criticism as a motivator. The idea is that by voicing internal criticism towards yourself, by punishing yourself for your failures, rewarding yourself for your successes, you produce an internal feedback loop of self-criticism that keeps you in line, that prevents you from being lazy, and drives you to success. I think especially from an American standpoint or a Western standpoint, the idea that the only thing that stands between you and everything you've ever wanted, including happiness, acceptance, success, anything else you want to achieve, the thing standing in between you and that, the common narrative is yourself. And if you were only hard enough on yourself, if you were only critical enough with yourself, if you only pushed yourself hard enough, you could achieve anything that you in theory wanted to achieve. With me so far?
With you very much so far.
All right. The book starts with a banger section on this, in my opinion, because I feel like she destroys it in just like a sentence. She goes, research disproves this. People who are highly self-critical are more likely to be linked to depression, anxiety, dissatisfaction with their life, self-sabotage, and a lack of achievement. How crazy is that? It turns out...
Yeah.
Sorry. No, you go.
No, I wanted to say, to a certain degree, it feels intuitive, like that people who are always very critical of themselves in their head, and are always kind of like giving themselves negative feedback, would not be like enjoying life as much.
Yeah.
And there is a certain like fake it until you make it um like aspect to success, in my opinion, tied more to charisma than skill, which self-criticism actually ends up like um running against and
Mm.
sabotaging. So those are my
You mean
first
that
thoughts
like
on that sentence.
self-criticism gives you a lack of confidence, and confidence is important for
Exactly.
success?
Yes.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, so I think it's interesting because obviously, if self criticism was the main thing standing between you and achievement, the most self critical people would be the most successful people, right? If it was just that simple, the relationship, um, it would be the data would basically look different, right? And the fact that people who are highly self critical tend to find themselves in a place of dissatisfaction and unhappiness, I think is very telling about how self criticism works as a motivator.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, to expand a little bit on this concept, right? The idea of self criticism is that your behavior is unacceptable in some way. And by critiquing yourself, you bring yourself into the correct shape. So this is an appreciation on the level of what you can do, right? We always need to be above average, basically, in positive qualities. We can't have bad qualities to begin with, right? So if we are smart and we're hardworking and we're thrifty and sophisticated and charismatic, culturally adept, right? If we have all these positive qualities, we'll find success and happiness. And if we don't have these qualities, we need to shape up. We need to somehow work harder, somehow produce these qualities within ourselves. And if we have negative qualities, we need to eliminate these. And this causes a fundamental issue with how we perceive ourselves. Studies show that like 70%, I think it was something like 70% of drivers think that they're above average. A full 80% of students think that they're above average, right? In their
Mhm.
class. Everybody thinks that they're better at everything than everybody else,
Mhm.
because to accept that we are average or below average in the majority of our qualities, which is what is to be expected of a bell curve of quality distributions, is extremely painful. And so we don't. For example, you can see how it varies by the positive qualities by society. If you look at Western societies, people tend to rate themselves as more independent, more innovative, more like leaders, more charismatic, traits such as those. If you look at like China and like East Asian countries, people rate themselves as being more humble than the average person, as being more cooperative, of being better team players, right? Um, so it's generally what studies show is that when it comes to attributes that we view as positive, we're blind and we assume that our own attributes, like attributes our culture sees as positive, we are more likely to overrate ourselves in. And attributes our society sees as negative, we're more likely to underrate ourselves in. So it causes kind of this blindness where we are driven into the temptation to ignore our shortcomings and blame them on other people and other circumstances, and or into this social strategy of hypercriticism, which is when you've messed up so badly and it's so clear that it's you, that you beat yourself to the punch. By harshly self-criticizing yourself first, you're showing deference to the others. You're saying, there's no need to get mad at me for the fact that I messed up this work project, because I've already berated myself for 5 minutes in front of you before you even got to it, right? And this is sort of like a model of almost like a subservience to the social norm, by saying, I know this is bad. I know this is really bad, and I'm already punishing myself, so you don't need to punish me in addition, right? To
Mhm.
sort of beat people to the punch. And both of those behaviors are unhelpful, right? Neither one of them fixes the situation or improves you, right?
Mhm.
Because neither one of them is focused on change. Both of them are just focused on punishment and judgment. And one causes you not to see yourself accurately. The other one also causes you not to see yourself accurately, right? Neither one of them take a realistic, measured approach to how you see yourself. And I think this creates a dynamic where we particularly prize ourselves for control of our environment and of our own personal success. It's kind of like we act like life is a game of chess and everyone has to be Magnus Carlsen. right? Like there's no dice, there's no chance involved, there's never extenuating circumstance. If you fail, it's on you. Like think about having an important interview coming up and you're stuck on the bus, and then the bus is delayed for reasons outside of your control. You still feel bad, and you still feel upset, and you might think to yourself, God, what are they going to think of me when I'm late to the interview, right? What kind of worker does that show that I am, right? You think to yourself, I should have left 10 minutes earlier. No, I should have left 20 minutes earlier. No matter how long the delay is, I should have left that many minutes plus 5 earlier, right? And that's painful, right? That's painful, and it's unrealistic because we are affected by extenuating circumstances. We are affected by situations outside of our control at times, and not all of our actions need to reflect who we are, but only what we're currently doing, in a way.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's So
no, feel free.
yeah, so I'm kind of curious now. You've sold me on the idea that if you're super super critical of yourself all the time, that is not a viable strategy to have a happy, successful life, whatever.
Yeah.
Or just to be at peace with yourself.
Yeah.
How does the book feel? What does this does she say anything about the other end of the curve?
Yeah, and I think we're going to talk about that a lot in a second. One thing I do want to finish off in this point before we get to that, but yes, it is an important topic, and self-compassion isn't just pure self-kindness. And it's not just blanketing yourself in comfort for every discomfort there is in the world. It's a much more nuanced approach in a way. So we'll dive into that in a second. Last few points I want to mention under this heading, as we talk about the myth of self-criticism as an effective motivator, right? Obviously, if it were an effective tool, the correlations would be different than they are. Also, I want to talk briefly about how self-criticism works. Studies of motivation and self-compassion and self-criticism find that self-criticism basically works on the principle of punishment, fear of punishment. If you do something wrong, you're going to be harshly criticized. If you do something right, you're going to be rewarded and praised by yourself. You're the own arbitrator of this. And so in fear of being punished by yourself, you do the thing, right? And I think this reveals another fundamental flaw of self-criticism. If you've ever worked in a group project with other people, or if you've ever looked at how nations work, keeping people in perpetual fear is not a sustainable motivator for them to grow and change. It is an effective motivator for some amount of time, but it's very short-sighted. One of the reasons is that it's paralyzing. When you don't know what to do, you devolve from fear into panic, and you stop doing anything at all at the one point in time when you should do anything at all, right? When fear of punishment and punishment gets too extreme, it makes you want to do nothing. It makes you depressed. It makes you feel like you're going to get punished no matter what you do. So there's not really any point to changing. It's also never satisfied. It never ends. It's never really, you're never really good enough. In the fear of punishment model, there's always something that you could be improving. There's always something that you could be better at, and always something to be afraid of, something to be anxious of. And I think this is one of the reasons why self-criticism is so heavily linked to anxiety, because anxiety has to do with fear of the future, fear of uncertainty, right? And if you're constantly afraid of harsh self-punishment, then unpredictable things happening in life is very scary, because you're going to punish yourself for them.
Yeah.
And the last thing I also want to point out is that harsh self-criticism is often absorbed passively. When you're a child, you internalize the criticisms of others and their external judgments, and you develop them into your own personal critical voice. And the problem with that is that self-criticism is often something that we don't actively produce, but passively bubbles out of us, and often encourages us to conform to the goals and values of the judgments of the people we are originally internalized, i.e., other people, not us, right? So self-criticism is normative to a social norm that may not be helpful for you, right? You may be, if you're living according to self-criticism, it's very easy to slip into this idea that you're living for everybody else, for everybody
Mhm.
else's comfort, for everybody else's standard, in the eternal pursuit of the avoidance of criticism, you're not living for yourself, for your own pursuit of your own personal goals, which may sometimes deviate from the social norms in healthy, acceptable ways.
Yeah. So about this, I had actually some thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
In the book, The Righteous Mind,
Mm-hmm.
which we may talk about in this podcast at some point, but it's essentially a psychological a book about the pursuit of where morality essentially comes from in humans and how it forms. If you think that's a good estimation of that book, of the book's topic.
Yeah, I thought that was a great summary.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was kind of thinking about that book while thinking about the topic, because in that book it talks about how different there is like um, East Asian cultures tend to be cultures of shame, of public shame, while Western
Mm-hmm.
cultures through Christianity tend to be cultures of guilt, internal guilt,
Mm-hmm.
more than outside shaming. Even though we do a lot of shaming. Uh, but my thoughts about it was essentially that this concept of self-criticism um, is kind of functions in a normative way, and it's funny because everything you said right now was kind of like thoughts that I had yesterday
Mm-hmm.
about this, in the sense that it may not be beneficial for the individual self-criticism, but it might work as sort of like uh, an internalized version of public shaming, in a way, to kind of keep people in a society behaving in a certain way,
Yeah.
adhering to certain social norms. So it's really not about it's really not about the benefits to the individual, but the the um, the benefits to kind of like having a society of people who conform.
Yeah. It's
And
like
in that
benefits to a
sense, it
social
feels
order.
like, yeah, and it also reminds me of a series of lectures by an anthropologist that I had listened to a while ago, where he essentially argued that originally the idea of self-esteem in humans biologically
Mm-hmm.
serves as a sort of like metric of how well you fit in your society and how well you
Mm-hmm.
perform by your society standards. So it's again not about the individual, but it's about
Yeah.
you fitting in society. So it kind of feels like self-esteem and self-criticism are these two barometers that tell you how well you are performing by your society's way. And that kind of also led me to thinking like, maybe it's not good for you as an individual to have for the self-criticism, but like, why have we kept doing this to ourselves?
Mm-hmm.
It was so bad. Why have
Yeah.
we kept doing this to ourselves? And the reason I think that we kept doing this to ourselves, that societies that have done this to themselves for a long time produce, they produce very organized societies that can do a lot, and they can survive a lot throughout history
Yeah.
through a rigid organization. So it
I
may
think
be
there's
less a
definitely.
topic. Yeah.
Sorry. No, you finish out, and then I'll say
Yeah,
what
I
I
want
have
to
to say.
say it may be less a question of like how good is it for you versus how bad is it for you, but it's more about like how much of your individuality and your personal mental health well-being is can everyone sacrifice a little bit in order to benefit from like the structures of society, the laws of society, the norms of society that allow us to live with one another and cooperate and not let it all kind of collapse.
Yeah.
Those were my
Yeah, I
thoughts.
think there was definitely a period in history when societal concepts that we today are very critical of were very efficient for their time at producing productive societies that maintained themselves.
Yeah,
And I think many
organized
of these
religion.
and I think many of these were like hierarchical societal models in which punishment and reward was the main way of interacting with people, you know? Um, and I think that um, it's very difficult to say in any kind of scientific way what social benefits self criticism has because you just don't have any kind of sample size. and you don't really have any universal metric to compare societal fitness on. So it's very difficult to say if self-criticism still has any benefits to societies as they work now in a very non-hierarchical manner, where maybe punishment and reward and unhappiness are not the only way to go forward. But
Well, I
I
would
think it's
argue that they're
interesting because I
even
think self-esteem is very much a barometer of how well it is often a barometer for how well you fit into society, particularly if your worldview is one of harsh self-criticism.
Mhm.
And she talks a lot in the book about self-compassion and self-criticism, and how self-compassion and self-confidence as well, right? And she talks about how self-confidence was often seen for a while as the universal mental health good, and is now much more seen as a product of a good baseline, but in and of itself is not enough to produce happiness
Mhm.
because it can be so conditional. There's many people who are very self-confident, but also very self-critical in the sense that whenever they fail, they meet norms often, but whenever they fail norms, they feel awful, right? Um, and so they don't necessarily have like great mental health, but they do have high self-confidence, like narcissists, for example.
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah,
But
I would kind of argue against the idea that we don't need um self-criticism anymore in this time than before.
mhm,
I think that arguably more hierarchically structured society
mhm,
requires less self-criticism because it relies more on external pressure to keep people in
mhm,
line, while a society where people are more where individualism and there's a lower like power gap between people means that in order for things to function, everybody needs to kind of decide to get along and play the game, which doesn't necessarily need to be enforced by self-criticism, but I think that you need internal, like something internal to drive people more if the external barriers are falling down.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that is slightly a side note to what you said earlier, but I thought was really interesting is I do think like self-criticism and like shame is something that keeps society working as it does. Like I think for example, when you talk about the patriarchy, right? I think there's many men who don't really want to act into the patriarchy, but are afraid of the shame and consequences that come when you defy it, right?
Mhm.
They're afraid of the harassment, the bullying, the cajoling, the humiliation, right? That they're exposed to by other men who are part of the whole shame network, right?
Yeah.
Because everyone knows if one of them dances out of line, they're soft and weak and unmasculine, right? And so that like keeps the patriarchy going, right? I think shame is a powerful. I think shame and self criticism are powerful tools for keeping society looking one way, but I think it's time that we get into how self compassion works differently and how self compassion can work as a motivator. I think it creates a society that is perhaps rigid and unquestioning, which is maybe not the best model. I believe a society that is less rigid and more questioning might have more potential for growth in the future. So let's get into how self compassion works differently. Self compassion what is self-compassion? Self-compassion is lending yourself the same comfort, warmth, and guidance that you would give to a close friend, right? It's the exact same concept of compassion that everyone is familiar with in terms of interpersonal relationship, and it simply applies the same concept to your relationship with yourself, so to speak. So, self compassion is about being able to foster a positive, supportive relationship with yourself where you lend yourself the kindness, comfort, trust, and understanding that you might have given somebody else. If you can think of a moment in life where you desperately needed advice or acceptance or comfort, and there was a good friend or perhaps a parent or some other figure in your life who gave you that good advice, who comforted you, who helped you out of a difficult situation, the idea of self compassion is to be able to be that for yourself because you're the person who's there 24/7. You're the person who knows yourself best. You're the person who knows best what advice might work on you, right? You're the person who knows your trials and tribulations and your full life history and your foibles and all of that the best, right? And you're the person who's always going to be around. You're the person you're going to have to get along with until the end of your days. Everybody else, can be exchanged. You know, you can always move to Antarctica or wherever. You move to a completely different country. Everyone else in your life can be replaced, but you cannot ever replace your relationship to yourself. That guy's going to be in the room with you no matter where you live. So what is self-compassion not, right? This is something we touched on earlier. Self-compassion is not just self-indulgence or self-excuse, right? Or just pure self-kindness. What it's about, what self-compassion is about, is accepting yourself on the level of a being and allowing yourself room for constructive change at the same time. So what I mean by that is when you're self-compassionate, you recognize that happiness and comfort are your birthright. You don't need to wait to be perfect to embrace yourself. You don't need to wait for your behavior to be perfect to be kind to yourself. I mean, have you ever met a friend who was perfect in every single way? No, but you probably have many friends with whom you interact still in a very positive way. You recognize their flaws, you recognize their strength, but you, no matter what they do, you feel an unconditional love for them, right? That's what self-compassion is about. It's about giving yourself the unconditional love and the space to comfort yourself, to accept the bad with the good, to accept when something bad happens to you, to allow yourself to feel that pain, and to comfort yourself by giving yourself compassion for it. And so, instead of being a motivator from a position of fear, it's more of a motivator from the position of love. Once you've accepted the fact that you're a flawed human being in a world in which you will make mistakes, in which suffering is a part of life, in which you don't have control over everything that's going on, you strip off this whole layer of ego and this encrusted self-judgment. You strip off that whole layer to allow yourself to change without judging yourself, right? By getting to be open with yourself about your flaws, you get to grow as a consequence. And so the main motivator when it comes to self-compassion is the desire to be better. It's simply the desire for life to be better. It's not the fear of punishment if you don't become better. It's, I might as well change, so why not, right? Once you accept that it's okay that I am where I am, it's okay for me to be flawed as I am, but I could be better, so I guess why not, right? The motivation for change is because change is good, right? The motivation to improve is because that improvement is probably good, right? Even if you feel happy with yourself and you feel I am worthy no matter what I do, you can still think, but I would be happier if I hung out with my friends more. And so then you might find the space in yourself to make that constructive change and hang out with your friends more. You might say to yourself, I am perfectly valid as a human being performing 50% at work instead of 100%. I'm perfectly valid, but I do actually believe in the mission of my company. And so I will commit more to it because I want to, simply because it's better, because 70% is better than 50%, right? And so when I'm in the point where I've stripped the ego out of it, when I've stripped the pain of change out of it, the pain of accepting reality as it is, it opens you up to grow from a perspective of, well, but I still have goals. Just because I accept myself doesn't mean I don't have goals in life, things I want to achieve. And that kind of love and compassion, studies indicate, can be a more sustainable growth motivator because it allows you to fail at times, to fall off the path and get back on the path. It allows you to deal with difficult circumstances that are or aren't your fault, right? Whether or not you're late to the interview because it's your own damn fault or because you're late to the interview because it has nothing to do with you. In both cases, you can give yourself the comfort to not panic, to not freak out at yourself, but to deal with the situation productively, right? So that's at a baseline. I have a few more things to say on this point, but that's at a baseline sort of the idea of self-compassion. The idea of self-compassion is not that you never make changes or you never say, I'm not sure that was the best thing to do, because, we give advice to our friends. We give advice to other people who we love, right? It's about having that baseline of love for yourself unconditionally, or compassion for yourself unconditionally, while still being able to formulate criticism. But when you formulate it, do it in a positive, supportive, respectful, context-aware manner.
Yeah, so here I have my other kind of I'm going to poke a little bit,
Yeah,
act as devil's advocate.
for sure.
What like so earlier we were kind of like I brought up the topic of like shame versus society of shame versus society of guilt, and you brought up the idea of being to yourself as as you would be to a friend.
Yeah.
And I think that's it's a great way to explain it, because often we are far more understanding of the flaws of our friends, and it's far easier for us to give good advice to them about, um, about their confidence and about their self-esteem and about what they're doing wrong versus what they don't have any control over, than we are to ourselves. Now the question from me is a little bit like, but can people do this? Can people manage to walk that line without falling into kind of like a lack of accountability and making excuses and basically indulging
Yeah.
in the self-compassion? Can they actually do it without having somebody else do it to them? Or is there a balance between the internal voice that tends to be more self-critical and the external validation of like a solid social system of people who tell you, no, you have value, no, we like you, don't worry?
Yeah.
And while maybe not feeling as good, is that a balance that can actually be realistically held up?
Yeah, it's like a question of extremes, right? The model of self-compassion tells you that harsh self-criticism is essentially never acceptable. And I
Yeah.
think for many people it's easy to convince them that continuous self-criticism and in fact extreme versions of self-loathing are not helpful. I think it's very easy to show people, right? It's
Mhm.
hard to show them that a model or they're slower in buying onto the idea that a model of self-compassion, of full self-compassion that doesn't emphasize self-criticism as helpful at all, that could work, right,
I
for a
mean,
person.
it's more like the idea of self-compassion that you describe to me sounds great.
Hmm.
My question is, like, can it actually realistically be achieved?
Yeah.
Can people
And
find that balance internally and maintain it?
I think there's sort of two ways to answer it. The first is, yes, it can be achieved, and there's particular methods. There's a practice to self-compassion. Self-compassion isn't just an idea that you hear, it's a collection of many ideas and a collection of certain practices that help and assist you in this process of being able to find that sort of universal love for yourself, no matter where you are in life and what you've done, while still at the same time being open to growth and change, in giving yourself that sort of what the author in the book calls discriminating wisdom, which is sort of like not harsh self-criticism, but good self-advice that you might need to hear, that's formulated in such a way that it doesn't hurt, but it enhances, right? And so on the one side, there's like specific techniques and methods designed to help you grow your self compassion and to become more self compassionate. That's why self compassion is more of a practice, right? It's not something you hear once, it's something that you train like a skill over time, um, and is a model, for life. The other way to answer the question is yes, because we know they exist, right? There's surveys that you can do to assess people's self compassion, and we find people who are highly self compassionate are often successful, happy in their life, satisfied with themselves. They grow over time. They have no trouble acquiring new skills or managing the difficulties of life. They have generally high self confidence. They interact with life in a way that we think is good, right? Like high self compassion correlates with good mental health and general life satisfaction, right? So there's sort of two ways to answer it. Yes, those people clearly exist, and research indicates that it works for them, right? And I wouldn't even say it's much of a balance. It's not really balancing self criticism and self compassion. It's committing fully to self compassion and leaving self criticism behind, right? But using self compassion as what it means, which is not self indulgence, not self excuse, not self kindness, right? Not just purely that, right? Self compassion is more than that. You don't just tell your friends, oh, you're right, that none of that was your fault. Sometimes you do give them constructive advice when they ask for it, right? So, On the one hand, those people clearly exist. On the other hand, researchers have basically developed exercises, which, like psychologists have developed exercises where they track people before starting the practice, and then they tell them, okay, do this once a day for so and so many weeks, and then they track them after the practice, and they find their self-compassion has grown, right?
Mhm.
So I guess that's the two perspectives that I would that I would answer the question from. But yes, I believe that the book has convinced me. Obviously, it's a book, it's research, there's always flaws, right? But the book has convinced me that it is possible to use only self compassion in how you deal with difficult situations in your life and deal with your self worth and your actions in your life, to only use self compassion and be a healthy, useful, happy member of society, right? Um,
Yeah,
So let's talk
it's
about discriminating wisdom, right? What is this discriminating wisdom? Because to me, when I first read it, I was like, this just sounds like self criticism with extra steps, you know? Um, so, what's the difference between discriminating wisdom? Um, discriminating wisdom and self criticism both have, in the end, the same motivation in a way, which is to point out a way of change. But they come at it from two different angles. Self criticism is do this thing or else. Discriminating wisdom is do the I understand you, and if you want to go down this road, you can. Right. So one is sort of a position of fear, one is a position of love. Other general things about discriminating wisdom. Um, discriminating wisdom is often not generalizing, but it's context aware. Harsh self criticism might sound something like, you're never going to make it because you're a failure, right? Discriminating wisdom would say, you didn't make it this time because there was this and that and the other thing going on, but you can make it, right? If you do X, Y, and Z. So discriminating wisdom is often context aware. It's often phrased much nicer, right? It's not as insulting. It's not as direct. It's not as harsh. It's not living in this do or die survivalist system. If you don't keep this gun to the side of your head, you will never be able to, you know?
Mhm.
There's way less pressure in it, right? Way less of a threat in it. And discriminating wisdom is accepting and comforting of reality. So this is something I really want to emphasize. Self-criticism, as I said before, leads to us often perceiving reality in a skewed way. Self-compassion is there to see you life in a more accurate way. When something bad happens to you, you get to accept that it's bad. You don't have to say, "Oh, well, I'm a good virtuous person to whom bad things don't happen." Right? So this is a fluke. This isn't real. This doesn't really count. You're trying to push it away. You're trying to push away the bad feeling. I don't want to feel bad. As bad people feel bad. Good people feel good. I want to feel good, right? You don't do that whole song and dance. When you're talking about self-compassion, it's about allowing yourself to feel the negative thing that's happened. You say, this is a moment of suffering. This sucks. Suffering is a part of life, though. And it happens to everybody, not just to you. And you allow yourself to soften, to feel that feeling, and give yourself compassion. You say, it is hard. It is hard to not be understood correctly, or it is hard to be late to an interview and be judged by others, right? You focus on that perspective, you give yourself compassion, and then you can give yourself that advice if you want for how to handle the situation better next time. So it kind of helps foster resilience and confidence because it helps you particularly when things go wrong, right? When things go right, the self-criticism and the self-compassion model look very similar. It's when you fail at something, when things go wrong, when bad things start to happen and creep in. That's when self-compassion and self-criticism work diametrically opposed, right? They say, imagine you're interacting with a young child, right? Who's skinned their knee. You don't say, well, that's probably because you're a fuck up and you didn't do it right, and you should run better next time. And you're just a moron. And I have no idea why you're even coming to me or why you would want comfort for your failure of a situation in the first place. Fix your problem and then move on, and don't come to me with it, right? Versus going to a child, I'm sorry. I know you scraped your knee. That really sucks. That really hurts. It's a part of life. It happens to everybody. And, I'm really sorry that it happened to you. And here, I'll give you a hug. And I've got you. And it's okay. Now, what do you want to do about it? Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think probably most people fall somewhere in between. in their head, right?
I hope.
And
I
I
hope
don't
most
mean
people
I
aren't
don't
treating
mean
their young children like that.
yeah, no, I mean I'm not talking about the child example. I'm talking about self-compassion versus self-criticism. I mean, I know one person or two whose parents might
Yeah, and
be
I
like
can
one.
think of
You know who
one.
I'm talking about.
Yeah, I can think of one person whose parent might act like that.
I can think of more than one person whose parent might act like that. One person even was on this podcast.
But
But
yeah,
yeah.
no, I think you're right. I think people naturally fall somewhere between the extremes, and the book
Mhm.
basically is trying to point out how if you're having trouble with emotional resilience and confidence, anxiety, issues like that, how self-compassion might be a model that helps you understand yourself better by not
Mhm.
constantly judging yourself on the level of of your utility, instead valuing yourself on the level of a being, right? Simply
Mhm.
because you exist, you have value. You're a human being, your inherent worthiness, value, and you deserve happiness, right? Happiness is your birthright. When she wrote that in the book, I thought that was really powerful. That you kind of view yourself from that perspective, right? And while you allow yourself room for growth, when you phrase your criticism, you phrase it instead as this discriminating wisdom, which allows circumstance to get in the way, which allows context to matter, which maintains this universal sort of acceptance or love for yourself, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
I think another thing that this discussion has made me think of is I remember a while ago you told me about studies that show that like the best strategy for like achieving long-term kind of like happiness
mhm,
with yourself is not to always try to kind of maximize your happiness in the short term, but to find like a cause, like to
mm,
find something to dedicate your life to that you believe is good and right,
mm,
and to work towards that, because that way even when things get difficult, you have an objective you have worked towards
yeah, kind of
throughout your
giving yourself
life.
a purpose over
Exactly,
just like
finding
joy,
purpose. Yeah, thanks.
you know?
Purpose, exactly. Yeah, and to me, like the self-criticism things feels a lot like the greedy algorithm of immediately punishing and immediately rewarding
Yeah.
short-term positive and negative outcomes and losing track of the big picture, right?
Yeah, I think that's
It's
a really,
like,
actually, a really important and really interesting point. Yeah, I think like by being self-compassionate with yourself, you open up the space for you to grow towards a purpose.
yeah,
Whereas like under the self-criticism model, you're kind of just always unhappy trying to find happiness immediately.
yeah, it's like literally like a greedy algorithm of like where do I get the best feedback now?
Yeah.
I need that feedback now.
And I think that's also part of why self-criticism is so paralyzing, is because when you are this greedy algorithm and you're in the pit of no good directions, which I think we get into sometimes in life, just a really bad situation where every direction you move in it requires some amount of pain.
Hmm.
There's just like no good options available, and you just have
Hmm.
to make your way out of the situation.
Hmm.
Self-criticism in a situation like that is really unhelpful because it basically demotivates you to go in any direction. So you
Hmm.
stay in the pit,
Hmm.
whereas self-compassion can sort of ameliorate some of that pain and help you get out of that pit. Because really, when you're in that pit, all you need to do is move in a direction. Like,
Hmm.
yes, some are worse than others, but you just need to get out of where you are right now, you
Hmm.
know? But that self-criticism can be so paralyzing because any direction you go in is bad, right? If I do that, then I'm an asshole. If I do that, then I'm a pushover. If I do that, then I'm selfish. Like, I can't go in any of these directions, right?
Hmm.
So you don't do anything, and that ends often as the worst decision, right? Is to just stick with your bad situation and not fix it.
Yeah.
Um, I had an example I wanted to bring up here. Um, uh, Proteus and I live together. We're together. We date. And Proteus buys
What?
the groceries.
Crazy.
Yeah. And this is an example of emotional regulation, which is something I sometimes have difficulties with. I found self-compassion was a really helpful method for emotional regulation in this circumstance. Proteus buys the groceries, and he's I don't know. He's just got like this base evolutionary hoarder instinct, I think, when it comes to food. He buys often, if you need, let's say, 10 items of food in a week, he often buys 12 items. And if you do that every week, but you're only eating 10 items every week, obviously at some point you have a surplus. And so I was telling
Well,
Proteus,
Severus, what are you gonna do when winter comes? and
Exactly. What
the
are you going to
grocery
do in
stores
winter?
run dry
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
barren, and the
That's why it
pasta's
feels like
gone.
exactly. That's why it feels to me like it's just like this deep ingrained like uncertainty.
Yeah, when
Um,
you walk when you walk the aisles and you see the bounty of nature, and
exactly.
the bread is growing on the shelves,
Exactly.
and the eggs are like pouring out, and the pasta grows from the floor out into the pasta shelves. You must take advantage of the bounty
You
of
have to
nature
take
right now.
advantage of these opportunities. And so the thing is that it's very difficult to drive up to the building that our apartment is in. So you have to drive a little bit further away to a public square, and you can't park there. So often the way we tag team it is Proteus buys the groceries, drives to the square, and then I walk to the square and I pick up the groceries. So I was telling Proteus, it'd be nice if for a few weeks we could maybe get like 70% of what we need instead of 120% of what we need every week, so we can get rid of our surplus a little bit. And it's also a little bit easier for me to carry. And it was our grocery shopping day. Proteus had gone grocery shopping and he came to the square. He pulled up to the square. I open up the door to get out the groceries, and I'm confronted by 5 bags of groceries that are full to bursting and were very heavy for me. And I'm a little short, so I'm not like the strongest guy in the world, but I don't know, I can bench 50 for like 8. So I'm also not like I'm not like a twig, right? And
Yeah, I
I
was
had
gonna
a
say, like, you work out.
yes, I'm obviously not like a pro athlete or anything close to it, but I think I am at least average or above average in strength for someone of my size and frame. Um, and I had a lot of difficulty carrying it. It was hurting my hands. I had too many different bags. The bags had weird handles. They were like digging into my skin and bending my thumb back. But
Ugh.
this public square is about 3 minutes from my front door. I don't want to leave the groceries sitting on this public square and take multiple trips. I really do have to take it all at once. And I was mad. I was so frustrated. I was angry. I was like, what in the world? We just talked about 70%. This is like 400% of what we normally need. You know, this is so much more, and it's hurting me, and I'm in pain, and it's causing an inconvenience to me now, and it will cause me an inconvenience later when our pantry is so full of food, right? And I was really angry and frustrated. And I sat down after I got into the apartment. I didn't put the groceries away. I was like, I don't even want to look at these. I'm so mad. And I sat down on the couch, but I had been listening to the self-compassion book all day. And I thought to myself, this is my moment. This is my moment to practice what she says in the book. And so one of the strategies she says is that mantra, right? This is a moment of suffering. Suffering is a part of life. May I give myself the kindness that I need in this situation. May I give myself the compassion that I need to overcome the situation. That was one thing I tried. Another one I tried is her sort of 3-step program, which is to sort of soothe, soften, to, I think it's soothe, soften, allow, or allow, soften, soothe, something like that. But the idea is that you soothe yourself for your pain. You soften yourself to the pain. Like you open yourself up. You really let yourself feel it. You're like really let it through you, right? And you allow it to be there. And then once you've given yourself that validation, once you've heard your own complaints and you've said, yeah, that really does suck, you start to calm down and you start to get to a place where you can have a productive conversation about the situation, and you can say, hey, this upset me, instead of being enraged and being like, oh my God, I can't believe you. That's the idea. And that's how it worked for me. I realized most of my anger was at not being heard by somebody, by not being understood. I said 70%. Why do we have 400%? Clearly, I've not been heard. I've not been listened to. And anger boiled up in me as this communicative emotion. The anger was giving me this drive to yell, to scream, to communicate my dissatisfaction with the situation, right?
It
A
also feel
natural
yeah,
biological drive to be understood by somebody.
yeah. It also feels like that's the more like reasonable and like real part of you that was anger, and the rest was more channeling pain into anger. You
Maybe.
know,
Yeah,
the way that like a wounded animal may lash out from the pain.
exactly. By sitting down and listening to myself and giving myself so much validation, saying, I hear you. Yeah, you're right. That does suck. That does hurt. and I feel your pain, and I'm sorry that you're in pain, right? By giving myself that validation, I felt it was exactly what I needed in that moment. I needed to be heard by somebody, and that somebody could be me. And about 10 minutes later, Proteus called me on the phone and said, "I'm sorry, I bought way too many groceries, and I know that I bought way too many groceries. How mad are you?" And I was like, "Well, I am upset, but I'm feeling much better now." And we had a very constructive conversation about it. And the next time around, Proteus bought way less groceries because we had a nice productive conversation about it instead of a screaming match. Um, and that was a moment for me where I was like, I think this lady might be onto something. That was a moment that for me really clicked.
Well, that sounds like you had a really good first experience hands-on with it. So I'm glad that it worked out for you.
Yeah, I felt like of all the emotional regulation techniques that I've like practiced and tried and heard people talk about, this was one that really worked for me. But not necessarily the very best, but I would say it's in the top tier. Like it's like one of the best ways to calm yourself down without suppressing. Right, you're not
Mhm.
pushing down and pushing away the emotion. You really get to feel it and let it pass over you. Kind of like the only way out is through. The only way to get past the feeling is to feel it. Studies
Yeah.
also back up that idea that humans are not capable of actively suppressing thoughts and emotions, and that when you tell them to actively suppress them, they get worse rather than getting better. One last thing I want to note about self-compassion, we kind of touched on earlier. Self-compassion is about your relationship with yourself, so it inherently drives you to complete the goals that you care about. The motivation is, why change? Well, change because you have this personal goal and you think you'll be happier with that personal goal achieved, right? Life will be
Mhm.
better somehow with that personal goal achieved. You'll have some measure of your purpose fulfilled, or your life will be better, or you'll have done something good for somebody, or something like that. But so it's about your needs and your goals. It's not about societal needs and societal goals. And those can differ in healthy, acceptable ways, right? Like, for example, if society wants you, if your parents always told you to be a big time banker and make money for the whole family, maybe that'll be the internal self criticism you'll have internalized. The idea that if you don't have any money, you're a failure. But if your passion in life and what makes you happy in life and the way society best utilizes you in life is as a teacher for children with special needs issues, then you're never going to make that kind of money. But can you still be happy? And if the answer is yes, right, then it's good to live for your own goals, not for goals that were instilled to you by your parents at childhood,
Now you need to
or
explain to me
people around
what
them.
special aids is and how do I not get it?
I meant special needs. Yeah, special
Mm.
aids is something different. Um, but so this is kind of the major overview, right? This is the major overview of the book. Uh, Kristin Neff seems like a great psychologist. She's not necessarily the best author. She repeats herself a lot, right? So from here on out, there's not that much new content, right? And I cut a few of the elements that are present in the book and expanded on the book for the purposes of this talk. So this is the essence. This is the essence of the model of self-criticism, how it works, how it fails us, the model of self-compassion, how it exists as an alternative, and its benefits that it has.
Yeah.
Um,
I wonder the
so
people who in the studies that she cites who already were practicing self-compassion. I wonder whether they would do it like if were they doing it themselves without knowing? Were they instructed to do it? And how how easy is it to like set goals for ourselves that are not somehow dictated by normative societal ideas,
yeah,
right? Like
like
I
it can be
mean
really hard.
it might sound like cruel or insane to say, but even helping children with special needs is something that society tells us is good,
Yes,
right?
exactly, right? So it can be difficult to determine, what do I truly authentically want? Because often it's like that situation like in a video game. It's like in a world with no rules and no restrictions, you can do anything you want. I say, I want to help the puppy, And it's like, well, because you've been socialized to want that,
Mhm.
right? Like even when you don't punish and reward humans, they still often act in ways that are complementary to what society has told them is good and bad. And they do so not out of a sense of obligation, but because they genuinely enjoy it. The idea of it just like I don't do bad because it makes me feel bad, and I don't want to feel bad. It's purely selfish. I don't want to feel bad, so I do good. I think it can be hard. I think it can be hard to determine what you want, and I think some people do practice self-compassion as a practice, as something that they've learned. But I think there are also people who just do it naturally. And I think that has to do with their relationship with others when they're growing up. If you grow up in a place of unconditional love, where you receive a lot of this discriminating wisdom and support from others, right? You are more likely to treat yourself like that. I think this is just my hypothesis, but if you grow up with a parent who looks at themselves in the mirror and go, "Ah, I'm getting fat again," right? It instills into you the idea that self-criticism is an effective tool for motivating yourself to not be fat in this example, right? And if you then learn being fat is something society frowns upon, then you start to build that internal self-criticism complex pretty quickly. Whereas if you see your parents treat themselves with kindness and they treat you with kindness and they show you what unconditional love is while still being able to guide you through life, then I think you grow up with that alternative model, and it might be much easier to integrate with that self-compassion. So I think it depends a lot on, like, I think some people do it naturally, some people do it in a practiced way, right? Self-compassion isn't a secret now. The book's been out for a while. This research, these studies have been out for, not forever, but, at least like, the earliest one. So I don't know, 20 years or something like that, right? So it's like not like a secret. I think there's people who practice it because of the research, but I think there's also people who just practice it because that's how they were raised.
Yeah.
But I think it is hard. It is hard to find what your own goals are in absence of what society expects from you. I think that's not an easy thing to determine. I felt this recently. I had a big decision when it came to citizenship status. Should I naturalize? Should I not? Should I give up my oldest citizenship? Should I not? And it's difficult. I was like, what do I genuinely want? Do I want to keep my oldest citizenship? Or do I want to get rid of it? Do I only want to get rid of it because people would like me to get rid of it? Or do I genuinely want to get rid of it? And it took a while for me to figure out what my answer was. So, yeah. All right. Let's talk about the 3 doorways to self-compassion.
I know that like where I want to go is where I want to go, because everyone in my family thinks I'm fucking crazy. So, it's like, no, I picked this. I was 17, I remember.
Well, so here's also the thing, right? Here's also the thing that I want to emphasize, right? Is if everybody is living for their own goals, but their own goals are often reflections of what society needs. When we were talking earlier about the societal dynamic of self-criticism, I think self-compassion creates a society that is less likely to blindly follow norms, but more likely to follow norms in the spirit they were intended in, right? And to adapt to context and circumstance, right? And it's like, look, the reason why people want you to earn a lot of money is because they thought that money was the best way to advance a society, right? They looked at societies, and the ones with the highest GDPs had the highest lifespans and the highest degrees of satisfaction and of material wealth, and excelled in all these other factors. So they optimized their whole society towards GDP. But now we're in a situation where maybe the metric of GDP is no longer a faithful metric of how successful a country and a society is. So maybe we need to adapt, and we need to strive for success, but maybe not success that just looks like money, right? And I think a highly self-critical society would have trouble making that transition, because the first one to dance out of line gets shunned and shamed, right? Versus if we're each living for our own goals, I think that transition is much easier, right? And I think truly, at the end of the day, when you take people and you take pressure off of them and let them be themselves and you give them compassion, they don't turn into indolent, violent psychopaths. They don't turn into lazy welfare queens who just collect checks. That's not how people work. People want to be useful. They want to be useful. They want to help, not just because you're holding a gun to their head. They don't just want to be nice because they believe in some eternal punishment that comes to them if they're not nice. Right? People inherently want to cooperate, work with one another, find love, appreciation, and community. And that's, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, with letting people revert, in quotation marks, to that baseline. I think many people could do well to revert, in quotation marks, to that baseline. Okay. the 3 doorways to self-compassion. That's her term. These are 3 methods that she thinks help you access self-compassion, especially if you never really grown up with it or you have a hard time accessing it. Her first is mindfulness. So mindfulness practice, often linked with meditation, is sort of an awareness practice. It's you train yourself to become aware of your surroundings, especially to train yourself to become aware of your interior world. Am I feeling tension? Am I feeling angry? It sort of cultivates a sort of meta awareness of what's going on inside of yourself. So you're not just in the anger, you notice, I am angry.
Mhm.
When you notice that kind of thing, it gives you the opportunity to react to it in an appropriate way rather than to just follow that feeling wherever it takes you. And generally, mindfulness is thought to help you learn to observe your own thoughts and to not over-identify with your thoughts. Just because an idea has come up in your head doesn't mean it has to be true, and it doesn't mean you have to act in that way, as that idea would suggest. Just because you've thought to yourself, I can't believe he's so insensitive and didn't listen to me about the groceries, doesn't
Mhm.
mean you have to believe he actually is insensitive. Just because that thought came up doesn't mean you have to trust that thought. And just because that thought came up and suggests to you to act in a certain way, such as to berate this individual, right? You don't have to do that. You don't have to follow that road, right? So mindfulness is about sort of cultivating this meta awareness of your internal world and the world around you to sort of let you see reality as it is and to not resist. There's sort of this expression that this one meditation teacher uses who's quoted in the book. I don't remember his name, unfortunately, but that's that suffering equals pain multiplied by resistance, right? So the idea is if you, let's say you're grieving, right? You're grieving someone. You're feeling a lot of pain, right? If you resist that, if you don't let yourself feel that grief, if you push it away at all times, you try to ignore it, that magnifies the amount of suffering you ultimately feel. And there's this idea that in mindfulness that maybe you can separate pain and suffering. That pain is something that's a part of life. You do always feel pain sometimes, but do you have to suffer under it? Or can you accept it as it is and say, yes, I am in pain. This is how it is. I feel compassion for myself, but that's okay, right? Instead of being like, oh my fucking God, I'm in pain and I hurt and I am so very angry and I wish I wasn't in pain and I'm trying to just get through my day, you know, and then you sort of magnify the amount that you suffer under it by building this resistance to the feeling. Um, so that's the first angle, mindfulness. I personally am a huge fan of like meditation and mindfulness practices, so that I was like, yeah, check, I agree. Um, the next is self-kindness. So self-compassion isn't just self-kindness, but self-kindness is a root there, right? And self-kindness is treating yourself with kindness, with patience, with compassion, with giving yourself trust and comfort and being nice to yourself. And there's some self-compassion practices that just tell you to just embrace yourself for a while, to just feel your hands on your own arms, embracing yourself, comforting yourself, telling yourself, I'm there for you. I hear you. I feel your pain and I'm sorry, you know? And there's like studies that show that this increases the amount of oxytocin that like people emit and stuff like that, which is sort of a bonding hormone, and other things. So self-kindness is another route. And another route is shared humanity. This is an important part of self-criticism and self-compassion that we've touched on, but I want to expand on here as well. One of the roads to self-compassion is recognizing that failure and struggle are universal to the human experience and that everybody suffers at some points. I think the self-criticism model often asks us to be superhuman, to be super competent, to never have anything wrong happen. And what happens is we start to isolate from other people. We start not to identify with other people, we start to sort of create this division between us and them. Us, the people who try, the people who are good. Them, the people who are bad, the people who don't try. So self-criticism leads you to naturally kind of isolate yourself from other people based on your merits, right? If everybody's equally worthy, society is very flat. If everyone's worthy based on their utility, society becomes very hierarchical. And so that creates this sort of separation.
And I
And
think it can even lead to like kind of the Schadenfreude, way of
Yes.
thinking, which is really bad because the people that you tend to hear the most of are like people that are usually close to you, like your friends. So
Yeah.
it might lead you to like feel like schadenfreude and compare yourself to people that you're supposed to have a non-competitive relationship to.
I fully agree. It's something she points out in the book as well, right? That in some cases it can even create this tendency that you tear other people down. This is a common behavior for narcissists, right? It's that when somebody accomplishes something great in the room and it's not the narcissist often has to tear it down somehow, point out its flaws, because they're scared of losing too much relative um, social credit, basically, by this other person overtaking them in their great achievement. Um, and when that status is challenged, we can also behave in really negative ways. When you see yourself as a superior person, and then something happens to challenge that belief, particularly for narcissists, they often react in violent, uncontrollable ways. They get very aggressive. They get very violent. They get punitive, right? They get cruel and cold, even in cases. It's like this idea that how dare you touch my stainless reputation? I will punish you so you never get the idea ever again to try something like this. Right. And so that's kind of this sort of social isolation that's the model of self-criticism can create. And the model of self-compassion instead very deliberately focuses on the opposite. So one route to self-compassion is to tell yourself it's okay. You never signed a contract that said, I'm going to be perfect and never make mistakes. Nobody reasonably can ever expect that from you anyways, right? So it's important to keep in mind that failure is a part of life that happens to everyone. It's part of the human condition. Welcome to the club. We're all the same here, right? We're all universally flawed humans together as a group. There's no in-groups of cans and cannots. There's no in-group of winners and losers, because then you're always afraid to be in the bad group, right? Instead,
Mhm.
view humanity as your shared pool of equally flawed humans who also go through suffering, and the suffering is normal. And the one example she gives, is that like in a worldview where anything that goes wrong is our problem and is somehow unjust, right? She says, imagine the 80-year-old man in the hospital with cancer saying, "Why me?" Um, and it's like, yeah, well, because cancer happens to old people, that's how it goes, right? Failure is a part of life and is often more common than success and often a better teacher than success.
Yeah. I mean, most people need to kind of like, if you look at like, in terms of success, most people end up somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if you learn to be okay with that, like, idea from the beginning, you're probably going to get somewhere where you want it
And
and
I
not.
and I think it's important also to look at that social comparison. Look at the most successful people in the world. They are often people who are not happy and can never be happy, because as though they have more resources than they could ever spend, it's never enough somehow. Success is never enough somehow. And that's a classic hallmark of the self-critical model, right? That
Mhm.
there's always a new level to rise to, and there's always a fear of a new punishment around the corner, right? Yes, I am more successful than 99% of the population, but for a superior being such as myself, that's the baseline. Success
Yeah.
is a baseline of the thing quality that I can accept,
Mhm.
and failure is catastrophic. Instead of saying failure is a part of life and success is a nice little bonus, right?
Mhm.
Instead, it's no, success is the baseline. Anything less than success is failure, and failure is catastrophic and unacceptable.
Mhm.
These are the kind of people who get perfectly average results in a game of chance and complain that somehow they never succeed, right? And they never get what they're owed, right?
I feel
Um,
like you're also here talking from experience. Someone you might
yeah, I
know.
mean, we talk about D&D a lot, right? How often have you heard somebody be like, 15? Does that succeed? Right? And it's like 15 is above average. 15 is a good deal above average. It's a good roll, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and often, or people would be like, they'll roll for damage, right? They'll roll damage for a fireball, and they're like, 29. And it's like, wait a minute, 29 is above average. Fireball
Yeah.
deals 8d6. Each d6 is 3.5 damage. So combine that together. That's 7 by 4. That's 28. 29 is above average, right?
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, God, what a shitty fireball, And it's just because we have we get into this mindset where nothing but clear victory is good enough. And anything below that is practically failure, because we want to be these superior beings who never fail, and we can't be. Okay, those are the 3 paths to self-compassion. My last point I want to briefly talk about is, what does self-compassionate growth look like, right? As a person who's been very self-critical in life, right? How do I know that I'm giving myself discriminating wisdom versus giving myself self-criticism that's not helpful, right? So here's just some bullet points. The motivation of self-compassionate growth is to ameliorate discomfort in your life, not to achieve status or the recognition of others, or to avoid fear of some negative outcome that others put on you. The advice you give yourself when you're going through self-compassionate growth is supportive. It's accepting, it's encouraging. I really want to focus on that supportive aspect, right? Support doesn't mean don't change. It means I'm here to help you to change, right? We support children, right? So when you take a child and you give them access to the material they need to thrive, access to the instructors they need to thrive, access to the space they need to thrive, right? You support them. You don't have to hold a gun to their head and say, do this thing or else. Instead, you can enable their success by giving them a better shot, by giving them support. The base motivation for self-compassionate growth is that you might as well achieve your goals. That achieving your goals is nice. There's usually a reason. Sometimes self-criticism is simply growth for growth's sake, to avoid that eternal fear of punishment. Self-compassion, the idea is, well, if a goal is good, you'll inherently want to achieve it, right? If you genuinely want to lose weight, then if you accept the weight that you're at and that you're valuable and okay at the weight that you're at, it makes it much easier to just go, but I might as well lose this weight I genuinely want to lose. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So self-compassionate growth is then also not about force or fear or judgment, right? It's not about you need to do this. It's about what you want to do. You reframe the perspective of life as, I'm in a position, I want to be somewhere else. How do I get there? Rather than, if I don't do this, I might be in a worse position. I don't want to go there, right? So like self-criticism, the fear model is all about where you don't want to go. Whereas the self-compassionate growth mindset is all about where you do want to go. Where do you want to go, right? And going there.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting. I bring this up for a lot of different aspects, usually more for economical stuff, but also in this more like socially oriented way, we have kind of like a concrete example of countries who do more of this, right? In the north of Europe. Countries that say, actually, you have to go home and rest and take time for yourself. And actually, we will give you money if you can't work.
Yeah.
We're not going to let you starve because you're a human and you're worthy of life and happiness. So if you don't find a job, here's some money so you can still live a human life, without having to worry every day. And it's not the same thing, but I think it's close enough to the idea of like, you have value in and of yourself, regardless of what you're doing, how productive you are,
Exactly.
And,
like if you have no money, right? What's going to help you get back on your feet? The fear of continuing to have more money, or starting capital that can get you going, right? Support or punishment.
Exactly.
I think it's also, if you think of it just psychologically in motivation, let's say you're on a sports team, you're trying to, do well in this game, and the coach comes out and says to you guys, you all suck. You suck. You're not good. You're bad at this game, but you could be better if you tried harder. Is that more motivating than if the coach comes out and says, all right, guys, this is what we need to do to succeed, right?
Yeah. You know what I thought throughout
You know what makes me feel really motivated? When people take a big old dump over my self-confidence. You know what makes me feel like a go-getter? When I'm scared. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think it's interesting, like the topic of criticism. I don't know if she has a special, a special like segment about this, but like I
Mm-hmm.
wonder how it relates to so-called gifted kids.
Mm,
Because hey, guess what? I used to be considered one of the gifted kids at school
mm,
because I did very well in a lot of subjects.
mm,
Because in math and in the sciences, I was doing very well, and I was also good at reading, and generally I had an above average like writing and reading
mm.
comprehension skills in multiple languages, and so it was like, oh, he's going to do so much. And I think that's, I mean, I'm not the first one to point this out for sure, but like that can cause some real damage later down the road. Because when
Yeah.
you're used to consider yourself that the standard is being above average, is being better than the
Mm,
others, and you kind of wrap your whole identity, or at least your whole like performance identity, like your academic or slash
yeah.
professional performance identity around that, then it can feel really painful when you're confronted with other people who are better than you,
Yeah.
or people who are, or like when you're in an environment of people who are all just like you, which is kind of what
Yeah.
happened when you go to university, right?
Exactly.
You're like, oh,
Exactly.
now everybody here was academically talented.
I couldn't agree with you more. Like, uh, the for me, the experience of going to university was exactly that. Like, riding really high on this wave of I'm better than the others. I've got all this stuff. I'm really, really cool. I'm so well qualified. And then hitting a difficult university degree like a brick and being like, wow, um, not only is this really, really hard and really, really stressful, but I am not better than the others. I am not
Yeah.
superior to them. In terms of academic performance, many of them outpace me. Perhaps most of them outpace me, you know? And it's like, yeah, you're high school smart, but are you university smart? You know what I mean? There is a
Yeah.
difference because the competition goes up. To hear from people then who were in higher semesters, there was one guy who said, oh, well, I sort of took on this whole research side project while I was studying the same degree as you. And we were like, how did you find the time for that? And he goes, well, it's uncomfortable for me to talk about at times, but if I'm genuinely honest with you, this degree was not very challenging for me, and I had lots of free time. It was just like, oh my
Yeah.
God, you know? And it's just like, ouch. And it's true. It's the reality. What's that guy supposed to say? He's supposed to lie? I mean, if reality is that painful, then maybe the way you interact with reality is not right. You know?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
but yeah, no, I totally agree with you. That was my experience as well, right? Was being like, how do I deal with my identity now that I know that I'm in this context? I'm very average, perhaps below average, right? Um,
Yeah, it's like,
last
because
marker,
if you used to be like, I'm the above average guy, my identity
yeah,
is tied with this, then does that mean that now I'm the below average guy? Is that who I am?
yeah,
Like,
exactly. You know, where am I? And it's very painful, right? In the self-critical model, it's very painful to be anywhere else other than the top. Even the top isn't great, by the way, but
yeah,
it's painful to be anywhere other than the top.
the top is very stressful.
Yeah.
It's like anytime
Yeah.
you could lose your crown.
Yeah. There's always someone better, right? Especially in our interconnected world. You always know of someone better. All right. Last markers of self-compassionate growth. Self-compassionate growth is not linear. It allows for failure, restarts, detours, and changes of plan. I find often under the self-critical model where like I said I was going to do this thing, now I need to do this thing or be a humiliating failure. Self-compassionate growth is different. He allows sometimes to say, I know you set out to do this thing, but really context has changed, and I'm not sure this is really what you need to achieve anymore. It might be better for you to deviate your plan in this certain way. Or allows to say, hey, look, you got injured, so now you can't perform the plan as good as you thought you were going. You know, I'm going to run a marathon. Self-compassionate growth would say, well, if there's setbacks, and that's okay, buddy. You know,
Yeah.
like you will find ways to run that marathon, and maybe you don't need to run that marathon. Is that really what you wanted, or is that something that you think society wants from you? My brother
Yeah.
once told me of an example of, I think it was my brother, of like marathon runners and or two sisters who got into running, right? And one got into it to run a marathon specifically. The other got into it for fun. And at the end, the running time of the for fun sister was higher than the marathon sister, who caved under all the pressure of needing to perform this thing, right? So often pressure limits our growth potential. All right. Self-compassionate growth is not growth for growth's sake, right? It's not growth for approval's sake. It's one of these things that I've taken from a different book called Atomic Habits. The idea that don't focus on the score, focus on the game, right? Let's say you're trying to play basketball well, you're trying to succeed at basketball. Don't focus on the score. Don't focus on, oh, they're up 1 point, oh, they're down 1 point, oh, this, oh, that. Focus on the game. Reliably play the game as best as you can sustainably, and the score will take care of itself. The score is a measure of the goodness of your performance, but your performance is not equal to the score, right? And so it's like focus on your system for doing things right in life rather than focusing on those scores, because the scores will come if the system is good. And the scores, sometimes if you optimize for a metric, that metric ceases to matter. Like I was talking about GDP earlier, right? There's like this, I can't remember who said it.
Yeah,
It was
I
a
was about to
famous,
bring it up myself. That law of like, once you make a metric a target, then it stops being a good metric.
It stops being a good metric, exactly. Okay. Self-compassionate growth allows help from others, allows support from others in. It connects you with other people instead of isolating you from them. Asking for help is non-judged, right? It's not that asking for help makes you better or it makes you worse. You're good how you are. Asking for help is simply helpful. So it's kind of like getting rid of this ego component of the self-critical model. And then lastly, like we said, it's about what you authentically want. It's what you would do if the opinions of others were of no object, i.e., doing something for the right reason.
All right.
That sounds. That was a lot.
Yeah, I mean, you sold me on it. I must say it was hard not to be sold on it from the beginning, because I think that's already a lot how I have changed my views over my life in the past 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
So actually coming up with argument against you was very difficult.
That makes sense. Yeah.
I think the social structural like counter argument is the most powerful here. Because on an individual level, it really sounds like there are no downsides, except are you able to keep it up? Is everyone able to keep it up? Can everyone achieve this point? Or some people struggle to not swing to one or the other extreme?
Yeah. Personally, to take the footing of devil's advocate, the thing that I find the most concerning is the focus on ancillary factors. Saying, I'm sorry, you couldn't have done better. The situation is as it is. I worry that puts you easily in the position of sort of a life victim, somebody who things happen to in life, not somebody who does things in life. And it can kind of easily justify sort of maintaining a status quo, even if that status quo is unhealthy. I think if you're doing self-compassion right, that won't happen to you. But I think it's something to keep in mind, or something that's sort of the part about self-compassion that still worries me the most. This idea that focusing on the aspects that take a situation out of your control, because I think it's genuinely better to focus on the things that put it into your control, not to judge yourself for the fact that you're in the position, but like, okay, I'm in this position. What can I do now to get out? Right. So not to take on the perspective of a victim like that too much.
I think that the thing is like everyone's self-compassion will have to look a little different.
Yeah.
Probably. And I think that one thing that we haven't talked about, but I guess that she does, but like I think either way it's probably something important here with self-compassion, is like you still need to rely on others to like find that balance. I find that like you and I do daily coaching sessions, at least when my mouth is doing okay. And I think that in those, I always try to walk the line between like telling you that it's okay if you don't achieve everything you set out to do, but also, hey, do you think that maybe you can achieve this and this tomorrow, even if it's like
Yeah.
setting a goal that maybe is a little bit ambitious and then saying it's okay if you don't achieve it. But hey, do you think we could try to push it up a little bit?
Yeah. I think the hard part is really just taking the judgment out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Taking the judgment of your own worth out of situations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Being able to say, look, this is the situation you're in. What can you do to improve? But remove the element of judgment for why are you in this stupid situation? Or what happens if you don't manage to achieve the plan that we set out, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the hard part, and the main distinction between self-compassion and self-criticism is the element of judgment. And I think it's difficult because it's easy to slip back into old patterns. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, self-compassion is a process, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
not a final state. There will be moments where you forget it and moments where you remember it. That's why it's a practice. That's why it's something that you exercise over time. It's like any skill, you know.
Yeah.
It grows with practice and patience, and that's okay. You know, try not to judge yourself for not being self-compassionate. That's also a common thing people do, and that's just, you know, now you're just recursing. That's also not
Yeah.
helpful.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah.
The goal is not to eliminate negative experiences, but to manage them better, right? So it's not that, oh, self-compassion is the key to nothing ever going wrong. It's about the key of eliminating suffering while recognizing pain, right?
And I think
Having
that's
this supportive bond with yourself to help yourself through difficult times.
yeah. And I think that's our button.
All right. Do you have any plugs this week?
Do I have any plugs? Well, last week we talked about Brandon Sanderson, and
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to encourage listeners who may be interested in creative writing, to follow his YouTube channel and follow specifically his 2025 writing lecture series on
Yep.
writing fantasy and sci-fi. I think it's very, very helpful. I had already listened to some of his 2020 lecture series, and I find that he is saying mostly the same things, but generally you can see he has polished the lecture. He has smoothed out some parts. There is new material to consume here. And so, yeah, in general, his YouTube channel is interesting. He has a podcast that I want to listen to, but I haven't started yet.
Yeah,
Sometimes he
me too.
talks about weird stuff, like today he released a video about Magic the Gathering, sending Wizard of the Coast sending him an unreleased card, and where he
Oh,
talks
fun.
about why he loves 3-colored creatures. So, you know, for the Magic the Gathering fans out there, might be something interesting. And generally, it's a good channel, and he sounds like a very, very nice and very grounded person, considering how successful he is. So, can recommend.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I admire about Brandon Sanderson. Is like not necessarily the very best writer I've ever read in terms of quality of written words on the page, but he
No,
really
that
strikes me as a quality human being. Just the way he interacts with the world seems very healthy and mature.
yeah, I
Uh,
actually like one of the best authors. Like, I can't currently think of someone whose reading I have enjoyed the most, just on a qualitative level of like the prose.
mm,
Is like Patrick Rothfuss, who wrote The
mm,
Name of the Wind, that I couldn't
yeah,
fucking finish because of
yeah,
how much I disliked the plot.
yeah.
So, you know, uh,
I think that's also a common criticism of Name of the Wind. My
yeah.
plugs are twofold. One, on topic for the episode. If you want to know more about self-compassion and you want to get it straight from Kristin Neff herself, go to self-compassion.org. There is they have seminars, they have exercises, but they also have a part where they basically do what we did this episode, where you can really interactively and in a really well presented way, in my opinion, go through the various arguments against self-compassion and for self-compassion and see why research indicates that the ones against are weaker and the ones for are stronger.
Let's
And
include the link in the description.
yeah, absolutely. The links will be in the show notes. The other plug is unrelated to this episode, I watched Mickey 17 in IMAX with my family.
Oh,
Um, I thought it was a good movie. I didn't think it was a great movie, right? Like, it didn't completely revolutionize my view of the whole world and everything. But I thought it was a good movie. There were some elements of it that like I might change or something like that. I had trouble at first actually coming up with anything I would improve, but then through discussion with others, I was like, oh yeah, that could be. I would maybe
I'm
slightly tweak
curious,
that
just
or
curious for
whatever.
myself. How did your mom like it?
I think she liked it. I think she liked it pretty well. I think she would
Interesting.
put it roughly at the same spot as me, maybe slightly lower. I would give it sort of like 7 or 8 out of 10, which to
Mhm.
me means one tier under greatness, right?
Mhm.
So it's like it's a good movie. Like it's definitely a solid movie, rewatchable movie. But like it's just like it's not quite at that level of like all-time classics, things that really inspire people for years to come, right? It's just like slightly under that.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah,
No, I
I
was
thought it
just
was
curious
great.
because I've heard like I had heard mixed reception
Yeah.
from audiences, and my parents definitely like had mixed feelings about it.
Mm.
But then a friend of mine really enjoyed it, and his parents didn't. And I started wondering if there's a generational aspect
Oh
to
yeah,
the people
maybe
who
there
enjoy
is.
this. But your mom seems to have liked it roughly as much as you, so it would be interesting. I need
Yeah,
more
but my
data.
mom's tastes are also very young. You know what I
That's
mean?
true. I
Like
was about to
she
say your
enjoys
mom
a lot
also
of
likes Guardians of the Galaxy, so I think we
yeah, my
need more
mom enjoys
data.
a lot of shows and like movies that are sort of often aimed at a younger audience. So but I don't know.
Yeah.
For those who don't know, Mickey 17 is about the idea of being able to print humans and like clone them. And Mickey 17 is the 17th Mickey who has been printed out of this printer, and it's about this idea of being an expendable, being a person who can be printed out. And it's like totally. I also have to say it's like totally my vibe. I was watching it and I was like, yeah, this is it. It mixes political commentary with like sci-fi futuristic dystopias in which exploitation through technology becomes so powerful that it becomes so extreme that it becomes so apparent to us how in real life similar trends exist
Mhm.
and similar issues exist. And I think it's a movie that really talks about a lot while at the same time it's fast. It is like the
Mhm.
opposite of like Zack Snyder Rebel Moon. Like there's like 4 different concepts for what could have been an interesting movie in this movie, and we move from one to the next. Like we never stay with any one idea for too long and really like get bored of it, right? It changes rapidly and quickly, the dynamics of the movie. And I thought
It's
that was
interesting. My
interesting.
parents are very bored by it.
I think
The
that's really
first part in
surprising
particular.
because I was like, oh, this is the concept of the movie, and then I was like, oh no, this is the concept of the movie, and then I was like, no, we're going into climax, and this is the concept of the movie, and then I was like, okay, now the movie is over. So I felt like
Mm.
the movie didn't feel beholden to being, um, I need to be a movie about sneaking around and like, are they going to find me and are they going to discover my crime and oppression, right? And it didn't need to be a movie about we're invading aliens, and it didn't need to be a movie about is human experimentation bad? It decided it would do all of those things, right?
I
And
see.
you could say maybe it's shallow, maybe they didn't explore each one as deeply as they could, and maybe not. But it was a romp. It was
Mhm.
fast paced. It was entertaining. The acting, by the way, I want to point out the acting was really good. I think that was the strongest part. I think maybe the script was more on the weaker side, but I thought the acting was really really great and really great performances by all the people involved. So anyways, I
Cool.
recommend Mickey 17. I think it's like, again, a 7 or 8 out of 10. Like, it's a good movie. You will enjoy it. Will you be watching it in 5 years? Probably not. But,
All right.
it's a great cinema experience. You'll
All
enjoy your evening, I think.
right. I'm gonna
With that,
sandwich your plug with another plug.
oh my God, this is
Yeah.
the
Uh-huh.
pluggiest episode.
Yeah, I'm gonna plug our YouTube channel. By the time this episode comes out, we'll actually have released some videos, which will be the exact
Oh,
same episodes you might have already listened to, but now with a sweet intro animated by me. So you might as well check it out.
alrighty. Yeah, keep an eye out for that.
Yeah.
Alrighty. That'll just about do it for our 23rd episode. If you want more, you can find us on youtube.com/@a-friendly-orbit, as well as Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you're feeling frisky and want to send us any of your astral echoes, you can catch us at afriendlyorbit@gmail.com, all one word.
All right, Ceres. I'll talk to you later. And to all of our fellow Voyagers, be kind to yourself, and we will catch you out there amongst the stars.